So we are still on module 2. You should have watched the video or attended lecture that talked about dehydration and hydrolysis reactions. So now I'm going to talk about the first group of biological molecules, which are carbohydrates. So for this section, you need to be able to identify the different monomers used to create carbohydrates. You need to identify the 3 simple sugars, and those are also called monosaccharides. The 2 simple sugars or monomers that make up sucrose, lactose, and lactose and maltose. And then finally, you need to know the structure and function of the 3 polysaccharides. Now, in the first part of Module 2, we talked about monomers and polymers. So remember back to the fact that monomers means one unit. It is one molecule, and you link these monomers together to form a polymer. Now, I mentioned before that the terms monomer and polymer are generic terms. And when we start to talk about biological molecules, the monomers and polymers all have different names. So the first monomer that we will talk about for carbohydrates is called a monosaccharide. Let me write this down for you here. So the monomer of a carbohydrate is a monosaccharide. So the word saccharide means sugar. Mono means one. Now, it's a little bit confusing, but these monosaccharides have, or these monomers of carbohydrates have different terms. So they could be called monosaccharides, but we also call them simple sugars. Now, there are 3 monosaccharides that you need to know for carbohydrates, and I have them shown here on the slide. We have glucose, which is the most common monosaccharide. We have galactose and fructose. Now, the molecular structure of these monosaccharides is pretty much the same between glucose, galactose, and fructose. The atoms are just arranged differently. So these 3 monosaccharides have the same structure, but slightly different properties. So let's move on to the next slide. Now, what I'm showing you here are called disaccharides, di meaning 2. So these are 2 sugars, 2 monosaccharides bonded together. Now take a moment and think about whether joining monosaccharides is dehydration or hydrolysis. So now you should be able to recall that dehydration, you go from smaller molecules or units to larger ones. And with dehydration, you lose a water. So an example of this, I'm just going to write monosaccharide here rather than give it a name like glucose or fructose. So we have a monosaccharide plus a monosaccharide. Now I'm going to put an arrow here because that is how we show a chemical reaction. Okay, let me try that again. There we go. So we have a monosaccharide plus a monosaccharide. Now these are being joined. You're going from smaller molecules to a larger molecule. So now you have a disaccharide plus water. Remember, dehydration, water is given off as those covalent bonds are formed. Now let's take a look at the three disaccharides that I need you to know. Now the first one is sucrose. Okay, sucrose is table sugar, and it is made of glucose and fructose in almost a 50-50 combination. So 50% of sucrose is glucose and 50% is fructose. So you need to know which two monosaccharides make up each disaccharide. So now we have lactose, which is present in milk. And lactose is made from a galactose molecule and a glucose molecule. Okay, you're adding those together and forming a covalent bond. And then finally, we have maltose. Maltose is a glucose molecule plus a glucose molecule. Now, one thing I want you to notice here is that every disaccharide I've shown you has glucose in it. Sucrose includes a glucose and a fructose. Lactose has a glucose and galactose. And maltose has both monosaccharides being glucose. So far, I have told you about three monosaccharides or simple sugars. We have glucose, fructose, and galactose. Now we have reviewed three disaccharides, di meaning two. So you put two monosaccharides together. We have sucrose, which is table sugar, and that is a glucose plus a fructose. We have lactose, which is a sugar in milk. Remember, all of these are sugars. They are all carbohydrates. So lactose is glucose and galactose. And then finally, we have maltose, also a sugar, with a glucose plus a glucose. Now here, that looks like I forgot to erase that drawing. So for the next two slides, you can watch this video on your own. It is about high fructose corn syrup, which hopefully most of you have heard about. It's present in a lot of our food products, products which you would not even expect to have a lot of sugar. Now, high fructose corn syrup means that there is more fructose than glucose in the sucrose disaccharide. I'm going to write that down for you. There are not going to be many questions on high fructose corn syrup, but I may ask you something about it. So high fructose corn syrup means there is more fructose than glucose in the disaccharide sucrose. And remember, sucrose is what we use as like a sugar additive to our food. Okay, I'm going to move on. And like I said, I'm going to leave these two videos, this one and the next slide, for you to watch on your own. Now, I just want to point out, you can see the video within your PowerPoint, but you have to be in slideshow mode. Or you can click on the link I put under the video, and that will take you straight to YouTube. Oh, there we go. Go back a little bit. There. Okay, so you learned about monosaccharides and disaccharides. So now we are going to talk about polysaccharides. which I gave you the definition right here on the slide. A polysaccharide is many simple sugar or monosaccharides bonded together. Now, a disaccharide is not the same thing. Poly means many. So I'm going to write that down for you. I think that it's helpful when you are learning these terms to try to remember what the root of the term means. So mono, I'm going to put equals 1. Di, whoops, equals 2. Poly equals many. So remember that monomer and polymer are generic terms. So when you are talking about carbohydrates, the monomer is a monosaccharide or simple sugar. The polymer is a polysaccharide, which means many units, many simple sugars bonded together. So I think I already wrote this for you, but I'm going to write it again. So monomer equals monosaccharide for carbohydrates. And a polymer is a polysaccharide for carbohydrates. Now, I want to take a second here and talk about the main function of sugars, of carbohydrates. Now, the main function is a quick source of energy. Let me write that down for you here. Okay, so carbohydrates provide a quick source of energy. And then the 3 polysaccharides I'm going to talk about have a slightly different function. So when I say a quick source of energy, I am talking primarily about your monosaccharides and sucrose. So the 3 type of polysaccharides that you need to know their names and their functions, are glycogen, starch, and cellulose. So I'm going to talk about those right now. Okay, so the first polysaccharide is glycogen. Now, glycogen is formed from many glucose molecules bonded together. Remember, it's a polysaccharide, many units, and glucose is the monosaccharide. So you can see that here. Every little circle is a glucose molecule. Now, the function of glycogen is energy storage in animals. I'm going to type that out for you here. Energy storage in animals. In my next slide, I'm going to show you what that looks like. So here we are looking at a process that occurs in your body to maintain homeostasis. Now remember, homeostasis is maintaining an internal set point, like your body temperature, right? If you get too hot, your body temperature rises, you sweat, that cools you down. If you're too cold and your body temperature falls, you shiver, and that brings your body temperature up. So this process I'm showing you in this slide is homeostasis as well. So let's look here at the set point. In your blood, you carry glucose. Remember, glucose is quick energy for your body. But you don't want too much glucose or too little glucose in your blood. So let's go over here to number one. You eat a cupcake, and that increases your blood glucose level. So, what happens then is your pancreas releases insulin. Now, the insulin travels through your blood and goes to the liver. Now, once insulin attaches to the outside of the liver, it tells the liver to bring glucose into its cells. So once insulin binds to the liver will then open up these passageways into its cells to take glucose out of the blood. So the result is your blood glucose level goes down. Now, when your liver takes glucose out of your blood, it stores it as glycogen. Okay, all those glucose molecules from your blood, they bond together to make the polysaccharide glycogen. Now, here is why we say it is energy storage. Let's go down here to number two. So let's say your blood glucose level falls. What happens then is your pancreas releases a signal called glucagon. And by signal, I mean it's a molecule that communicates with the liver when it binds to the outside of the liver. So when glucagon hits the liver, it tells the liver to break down those glycogen polysaccharides and to release glucose molecules into your blood. One moment. So what I just showed you is the process that regulates glucose in your blood. Too much glucose, it enters the liver. All those glucose molecules bond together with covalent bonds, and glycogen is formed. Your blood glucose level falls, the glycogen starts to break apart, and the glucose re-enters your bloodstream. Now remember, the polysaccharide glycogen, when it forms from glucose, that is dehydration. You're going from glucose molecules, which are smaller, they all bond together to make glycogen, which is larger, and water is released. When glycogen is broken down to glucose, that is hydrolysis. Water is required and it breaks those covalent bonds. So you're going from larger to smaller molecules. Okay, let's continue with the next slide. So glycogen is the first polysaccharide that you need to know. The second polysaccharide is starch. So I asked you on the slide what the function of starch is. So first of all, starch is made from glucose molecules, just as glycogen is. Now, the function of starch is energy storage in plants. Okay, so in a similar way to animals, when there is a lot of glucose in the plant, now remember, plants produce their own sugar. They produce glucose through photosynthesis, and that glucose has to be stored. So all those glucose molecules bond together through dehydration to make starch. And when the plant needs some of that glucose to grow, or flower, anything like that, that a plant would need energy for, the starch breaks down and the glucose enters the plant fluid again. Now, finally, you need to know the polysaccharide cellulose. Now, cellulose is in the plant cell wall, and it gives structure to the plant. It makes those cell walls rigid. Think about like the stem of a plant, right? It has to be upright. So something needs to make it strong, and that is cellulose. Now, just as with glycogen and starch, cellulose is made of many glucose molecules bonded together. So I asked you here, which monomer is used to make cellulose? And again, it is glucose. So that is all I have for carbohydrates, but I want to do a quick review. You need to know the three monosaccharides or simple sugars, same thing. That's glucose, fructose, galactose. You need to know the three disaccharides and what they're made of. So we have sucrose, and I'm going to type this out for you just as a reminder. But of course, you can always go back to the slide and get the information there. So the three disaccharides, we have sucrose, which is glucose plus fructose. We have lactose. Remember, that is the sugar in milk. You have glucose plus galactose. Now, one way to remember this is that galactose has the word lactose in it. And then finally, we have maltose, which is glucose plus glucose. So if I ask you a question about what makes up one of these disaccharides, you should know that glucose is a component of all three. Now, finally, you need to know the three polysaccharides, the fact that they are all made of glucose, and you need to know their function. So we have glycogen, energy storage in animals. We have starch, energy storage in plants. And then finally, cellulose. I'm just going to say structural support in plants. So remember, cellulose is present in the plant cell wall. So I am going to follow this up with three short videos on the rest of the biological molecules. So I will have a video for proteins, a video for lipids, and a video for nucleic acids. But all together, those four videos plus the video on dehydration and hydrolysis all go into module 2.